Roger, can I start with you? What would be, from all of your experience, you've probably studied working with historic buildings more than most. What would be your top tips for anyone that's thinking about taking on a project of renovating or adapting a historic building?
Well, I think the first thing you need to think about is living with the building or using the building and actually getting to know the building and understand the building. And the second thing is to get really experienced people on board to help you if it's a big project. It's not always worth trying to do it on your own. And thirdly, I'd say get in touch with the local conservation officer if it is a listed building or a building of value.
Okay, thank you. Now, if there are any questions from the audience at all, I'll walk around with a mic. Any questions at all? Yes, this gentleman here, sorry. If you could just say who your question is and your name, please, if that's okay.
Is that on? Yeah, all right. My name's Anzir Boudou. Just a question about looking at some of the really wonderful design in there and how to sort of integrate new into old. Just brings up the question of cost potentially, with many buildings falling into disrepair because there isn't the money to spend on the upkeep of them. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on actually losing buildings and losing a potential to do good things, because many of these things either are very costly to do or may be perceptually very costly to do.
Okay, thanks. I'll pick up on that, and then I think I'll pass to Roger. There's two parts to that. The first part is around maintenance. Maintenance isn't actually that costly. It just requires planning, and it requires organising, and it requires a continual concern about what needs to be done. If buildings are maintained, then they survive. Historic buildings, they survive, and they can survive for an awful long time. Just look at all of the wonderful medieval buildings we still have in this country. In terms of new build or adapting a historic building, yes, the costs can be more because you require more input from an architect, you require different sorts of materials, but you'd be surprised that the costs sometimes are not that much different from starting from scratch. When you put in demolition, dealing with waste, we have to pay for quite a lot for getting rid of waste now. But the other aspect of that is that the value at the end of restoring a historic building rather than building something new can often be much greater, so it's worthwhile. I don't know if you want to add to that, Roger.
I think your last point is actually one that is often overlooked, that if you've got an old building and you are adapting it, making it into a really good old/new building, the value is going to be much, much more than if you go out and build just a new building on its own. And I think, as Ian says, the maintenance issue is key, and I think the problem is so many people do rush into projects, they don't use the appropriate materials, and it actually ends up costing an awful lot more in the end, because if you use the wrong materials, you're storing up problems for the future, and you're storing up expensive problems potentially, and you will lose even more of the old building if those incorrect materials are used.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions at all? Yes, lady over there, just in the purple jumper.
Hi there, my name is Maria Hanrahan. I just have a question for you. One of the things I like about historic buildings is that the sacrificial materials that are designed to be replaced are generally on the outside of the building. They're easy to access. They do have a higher cost in some cases because they can be quite repair hungry, but the advantage is that unlike with a lot of new buildings, things can be accessed, whereas lots of sacrificial or materials that have a short lifespan in newer buildings are located behind finishes and can actually in the long term work out to be a lot more expensive. How can you go about raising awareness of that so that people understand the benefits of the historic environment and older methods of building? And I have another question as well, if that's all right. what can be done to make the use of materials like hemp insulation and wool, more widespread, so that it becomes more cost effective for people.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Do you want to pick up with the second question first, Roger, and then we'll both double handle, and maybe Matthew can help with the first.
Yeah, I think the issue of materials is a key issue, and it's one I'm sort of passionate about. I think we're all trying to bang on about using these materials, and how you get that message across is very hard, and hopefully shows like this do it. But I think that the issue with materials that we should be thinking about is health. Because old buildings actually, although people sometimes talk all about the damp, old buildings are actually a lot healthier potentially than new ones. And I think we need to think about that an awful lot more, about using materials that are healthy. I mean, one of the best nights sleep I had was in a hemp cottage. And just, the smell of it, the feel of it, and everything else. And if we can get those sort of messages across when we're working with old buildings, I think it will be really useful.
Okay, thanks. Matthew, do you want to...
Does this sound? Yep, that's it. In a past life, I was the project director for the All Souls Bolton project, which you saw in Roger's presentation. One of the things that we did in the delivery of that was a traditional building training program. So we had kind of a number of sessions, workshops on lime and things like that. And these were hugely popular with the local community, with colleges, with students, and just the demand, the desire that there is out there for learning more about traditional materials and traditional building skills. We were overwhelmed, having to turn people away. So just the demand for it and our ability as a sector to provide more training and more awareness, it will be taken up if we can provide more of it, basically.
So I'll just add to your point about how do we raise awareness to these really important issues. And I think that a lot of that comes from responsibility to my organisation, Historic England. We've tended in the past to operate on a sector-to-sector kind of conversation. We've been talking to the professionals, the construction industry, not to the general public. And I think we've woken up to that we need to be able to get these messages out. The majority, 2/3 of all heritage in this country, historic buildings in this country, are in private ownership, are owned by members of the public, and we need to be able to reach out to them, give them the information, work with the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings, who run a wonderful website with information for private owners, but also run campaigns to make people more aware, both in terms of the importance of maintenance, but also what you need to take into account to really enjoy a wonderful building for a long time.
Can I just add just one thing? I think a lot of people are scared of traditional materials. And there's actually no reason to be scared of traditional materials, because we know more about traditional materials than we know about new materials. And they're actually not very difficult to use, and they're great fun to use. So I think it's really important to take that on board and not be scared of a bag of lime mortar or whatever. It's really important to understand that.
Okay. Thank you, Roger. Time for another question. Does anyone have a question? Yes, thank you.
Hi, I'm Rosanna Sheehan. I think this is a question possibly mostly for Matthew, which is, I work for Oxfordshire LEP, and we see a lot of people coming to us who want funding for projects to do with, as you can imagine, a lot of built heritage in Oxfordshire that communities, very engaged communities, want to preserve, but the funding isn't there for those projects. So what advice would you have for community groups who have well-developed projects that they want to put in place but can't find funding?
Good question. The situation with public money is becoming more and more challenging, and I guess organisations that come to us that want to do a purely conservation sort of led project, we're finding those projects are harder and harder to kind of fund. It's about how conservation or heritage projects can also maybe tap into other sources of funding. So how do you present a project that has a wider benefit but also has a conservation heritage element to it as well? So that ability to turn a project into a community project or a heritage project or an economic development project, these are the things that are increasingly important. Also the role of kind of different types of investment. I touched on it in my presentation. So whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's community shares, these are different ways of raising finance alongside grant funding. Still remains very important to find grant sources, but these other sources of finance are becoming increasingly important. We just launched a new fund called the Heritage Impact Fund last week, which is a new partnership fund with Historic England, National Lottery Heritage Fund, and this is about getting more social investment into heritage projects, basically.
Yeah. I'll just add to that actually, because the LEPs are increasingly important, and recognising the role that heritage has in achieving economic growth is becoming much more alive to politicians. So the Stronger Towns Fund, the Shared Prosperity Fund, when it's eventually announced, heritage will be part of that. There will be a component that recognises the value that heritage brings to achieving economic growth. Any other questions at all? Are we? Yep, we still have time for another question. Yes, gentleman here in the grey coat.
Question, because there's a building in Farnham called the United Reformed Church, quite a nice sort of Gothic, revival Gothic building in the 1890s by Thomas Wonnacott. And next to it there's an addition built in 29, which is quite a substantial, in a similar Bargate stone, which is being proposed to be demolished by the church to be replaced with something pretty awful. And they've got their ecclesiastic permission. And Historic England have more or less said, well, it's not important enough, and have sort of said leave it up to the historic building officer, who's more or less, I don't know, not really being. So as a local architect, I'm activating to protect it. It's in planning now and could get approved, likely be approved, and it's terrible.
Yeah. This is always the problem for me. Whenever I come to a conference, I always get specific cases. All I can say is, we have a statutory remit, and that we can't operate outside that statutory remit, because then we start to blur lines, and that is the problem. What we try and do, though, is we try and work with the other, other bodies. In that case, it will be the DAC. Diocesan Advisory Committee that's been given advice on that matter. We try and influence those through advice. It doesn't sound as if we're going to be helpful in this situation because the decision's already made, but we can't. We have to operate within the confines of our statutory remit, but try and influence good practice as much as we can through other means, through training events. We run a training program for places of worship, for local authorities, historic environment, local management, which if we had more resource, we could do a lot more of it. But yeah, I sympathise. There are lots of those issues which, for us personally, and how much we care about the historic environment, it's as painful for us as it is for you. But there is a limit to what we can do. Sorry. Okay. Any other questions at all? I think there really is time for just one more. No. Oh yes. Sorry, the lady there. Thank you.
Hi, it's Ivana. It's sort of a question, I suppose. I was observing that a lot of Victorian and Edwardian properties across the country, actually, but also particularly in London, they are all around, but we have a shortage of housing. And although I appreciate that the heritage has to be saved, and lots of buildings do, I wonder if there is a thought in the wider society that some of these properties might be able to be actually knocked down and then rebuilt to build higher, taller buildings which will provide more housing, because they are large areas of terrace houses which are only 2 levels, so ground and first floor, and they are not allowing for the space for other properties, which obviously with the shortage of the housing in the country and particularly in London would be a very valuable land, basically. So I wonder if there is any conversation about that, or any consideration if that would be something to consider, I suppose, in the future? Thank you.
Absolutely, it's a really good question, and as you can imagine, it's something that we've been discussing with government in a lot of detail over a long period of time, because the housing crisis is a national crisis, and it needs a solution with everyone working together. What I would say to that, though, is that it doesn't have to be demolition and new build in every case. We commissioned Arab Consulting to look at density, achieving housing density in historic areas. And actually, it's always possible, always, 99% of the time, it's possible to achieve the level of density that we need for new housing to meet the housing requirements by really careful and selective design. That may mean occasionally some demolition of less significant historic buildings, and we're consenting to that all the time. You know, we're not saying absolutely everything has to be kept, but it's about recognising what is important, what needs to be kept for the character of a community, recognising what its character is and how you can enhance that through new development. As Roger's been showing, you can actually bring more out of historic building with quality of new development. But you can definitely, in most places, achieve the level of density that is required to address the housing crisis. It just requires good planning and sensitive design.